Hello everyone, and welcome to the video for Chapter 8, Section 3, The Crusades and the Wider World. So this chapter is going to deal with the late Middle Ages, which starts around the year 1100 or so, right? And at this time there were advanced civilizations in Asia, the Middle East, and even forming in the Americas. But Europeans were still pretty much unaware that any of these places existed. Remember that in the Dark Ages, Europe was cut off from other parts of the world. Starting in the late Middle Ages, though, Europe started to reconnect itself with the outside world, hence the second part of the title for this section, The Wider World. And much of this was due to the series of wars known as the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were a series of wars where Christian knights traveled to the Middle East to fight Muslim empires for control of that land. And before we get into the specific Crusades, let's first get a little background. Let's talk about a group known as the Seljuk Turks. Now, we're going to learn more about them in Chapter 10, but for now, just know that they were a Muslim group who had conquered most of the Middle East by this time. And by the year 1050, they had invaded the Byzantine Empire. We're going to learn a lot more about the Byzantine Empire in the next chapter, but it was what came from the Eastern Roman Empire after the Western Empire collapsed. We learned in Chapter 5 that before Rome fell, the empire split in two. So hopefully you guys should remember this map from Chapter 5. You have a Western Empire and then the Eastern Empire in purple with its capital here, Constantinople. And in the year 476, Rome fell, but that was only for the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire continued on and would survive for centuries after the fall of Rome. Today, we refer to that empire as the Byzantine Empire. Let me get rid of this. And this is what the Byzantine Empire looked like at the end of the 12th century. So just right in here, this yellow part, all right, that's in like a couple of scattered little islands here. That's all that remained of the Byzantine Empire. So by almost around the year 1100, it had shrunk pretty significantly. So you see here is your Roman Catholic territory in orange. You've got your Holy Roman Empire. You've got Italy. You've got France. Then you've got your Muslim territory. In particular, this one here, the Seljuk Empire. Even though they spell it with a Q, it's still the same as what we're talking about here, the Seljuk Turks. But the Byzantine Empire had shrunk pretty significantly. It was really just in and around Greece and then a couple of islands in the Mediterranean. So let's get back to the Seljuk Turks. By the year 1076, not only had they pushed into Byzantine territory, but they had conquered the Holy Land. Now, let me just move me down a little bit so we can see the full map here. The Holy Land was the area of Palestine where Jesus and other key figures from the Bible were from. And the key city in this area was here, the city of Jerusalem. Muslim empires had controlled this region for a while, but it was really never much of a problem for European Christians. In fact, Christians were often allowed to make pilgrimages or holy journeys to places like Jerusalem. But the Seljuk Turks threatened the Byzantine Empire. You see how the Turks, this green area in here, as they're pushing more and more into Byzantine territory, that's now becoming a problem not only for the Byzantine Empire, but all Christians in Europe that would potentially want to make that pilgrimage down to Jerusalem. It potentially is now being cut off. So because of this, the Byzantine Emperor asked Pope Urban II for help. Now, the Byzantine Empire worshipped a different branch of Christianity from Western Europe. Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more detail next chapter. But they're still Christian, okay? Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity is still the same roots of their religion. And the emperor thought he could win the support of Europeans by making it a Christian versus Muslim conflict. And he did. In the year 1095, Urban called the Council of Clermont, and this was a meeting of many of the top nobles and bishops of Europe, and he called on all Christian knights to reclaim the Holy Land from the Turks. Now, he did this for several reasons. The most important one was that he wanted to unite Western and Eastern Christianity as it was before the Roman Empire split. He also believed it would increase his power in Europe. It would show that he could command knights, nobles, even kings of different lands to fight for one Christian goal. Now, thousands of men took up Urban's call to war. Before we get into some specifics on the actual Crusades, let's first take a look at the reasons the Crusaders had for going on these dangerous journeys. Men from all social classes were being asked to travel thousands of miles. Right? You look at the map here. You had guys from up here in Germany. You had guys from France. You had guys from Italy. And they were traveling miles and miles through Byzantine territory and then down here and then eventually... Actually, let me move me because I'm covering Jerusalem right now. There we go. All right, all the way down to Jerusalem here. So the journey itself took a long time. And it was very, very dangerous. Most of them did not return home to Europe. So what motivated so many to participate? A lot of it came down to religious faith. Whoops. There we go. Many of the men who went on crusades truly believed they were fulfilling God's wishes by reclaiming the land of Jesus' birth. As this old drawing from a medieval transcript shows, many of them thought that they were saving these infidels, right, by bringing the true faith of Christianity down to them. There were some other less high-minded reasons, though. One was this thing called remission of sin. Now, what this means is that anyone who went on a crusade would have his sins erased or forgiven. And make sure you get that part down, okay? If you went on the Crusades, all of your sins would be forgiven. So it was kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Unfortunately, though, it made many crusading knights feel that they could commit horrible, violent acts, such as killing innocent civilians, and they would be forgiven since it was done during a crusade. Another reason was the promise of wealth and glory and land. Many knights, especially those of lesser rank, believed they could rise in rank by capturing treasure or land. Ultimately, though, despite all the manpower and fighting spirit committed to the Crusades, it was generally a losing effort. Only the First Crusade was successful in achieving the goal of conquering the Holy Land. In the year 1099, the Crusaders captured the city of Jerusalem after a long and bloody campaign that saw thousands of Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem massacred. And after winning the Holy Land, they divided the area into 4 Christian Crusader states. As you can see, it divided up here. And now the Muslims constantly sought to overthrow these states, leading to later crusades. And in the year 1187, Jerusalem was taken by Muslims, led by their famous commander Salah al-Din, known to Europeans as Saladin. Now this leads to the Third Crusade, where Saladin maintained control of the city, successfully repelling the Europeans. And while they failed to win it back, Saladin did agree to allow Christian pilgrims to travel to Jerusalem again. So there was a compromise made between Saladin and the Christian commanders. Now, the Third Crusade was the closest European knights would ever come to taking back the Holy Land. Later crusades were all failures. Crusades were launched into other Muslim-controlled lands with no success, and the Fourth Crusade was truly disastrous. Crusading knights agreed to help wealthy merchants in the Italian city of Venice defeat their trade rivals in the Byzantine Empire. Crusaders were allowed into the city of Constantinople and looted and destroyed much of it. So, while the Crusades started out as a Christian quest to reclaim the land of Jesus' birth, they ended with Christians slaughtering other Christians. The Crusades did, though, have a tremendous lasting impact on European society. Let's look at that impact now. First and foremost, the Crusades left a legacy of religious hatred between Christians and Muslims. There were atrocities on both sides, and both religions are still dealing with the violent legacy today. Not all the impact of the Crusades was negative, though. There was tremendous economic expansion in Europe. Even before the Crusades, trade had started to open up between Europe and the Byzantine Empire, and these crusaders who returned to Europe brought with them fabrics, spices, perfumes, all these fancy things from the Middle East, and this in turn increased the demand for these goods in Europe, leading to increased trade between Europe and the Middle East. You see the expansion of trade routes after the Crusades. All right, now, Europe, which was previously cut off, these trade routes, they're connecting it to Constantinople here. I'll get to that in a second. And even other areas down along the eastern Mediterranean. All right. Now, I got a little bit ahead of myself with clicking that, but most of the trade went through these Italian port cities, right? As ships were coming through the Mediterranean, they were going through Italy first. Remember, Italy's location in the Mediterranean is what gave the Roman Empire an economic advantage, and now these individual Italian cities are doing the same thing, especially cities like Venice, and they were becoming extremely wealthy. This is going to be an important thing to remember when we learn about the Renaissance and why it started in Italy. Besides economic expansion, the Crusades also increased contact between Europe and the rest of the world. Europeans were becoming more aware that there were old civilizations all over the world, and some Europeans even dared to venture to these far-off regions. In Chapter 12, we'll learn about one such European, the Italian merchant Marco Polo, who traveled to China and lived there for years. Lastly, the increased contact brought an exposure to, quote, new ideas. Now, the reason I have new in quotations is because they were new to Europeans, but they weren't new to the world. During the Dark Ages, Europeans had lost knowledge of classical works from Greece, Rome, and other civilizations like the Middle East and India. Now, due to trade and travel, the work of these classical scholars started making their way through Europe. Right, so they started to rediscover the works of Socrates and the mathematics of Indian scholars, okay, and the philosophy of Arab scholars as well. The Crusades may have been largely a failure, but the spirit of the Crusades, that Christianity can assert itself by force, continued in other parts of Europe. An example of this is the Reconquista. Now, Reconquista roughly translates to reconquest. And it was the reconquest of Spain from the Muslim empires. Spain had been conquered by the Muslim empires. Okay, let me get me down here. Sorry, guys. There we go. All right, so around the year 756, all of the green shaded areas are under Muslim control. You can see only this little area up here is independent from Muslim control. All right, so you did have several tiny Christian kingdoms that had emerged over the centuries, and over the centuries they would eventually lead to a Christian conquest of Spain. And by the 1300s, you can say that this is 1265, the only area that is outside of Christian control is this little area in green down here, and that is the Muslim kingdom of Granada. All right, so that was the only part that was not under Christian control by the 1300s. Notice how they're different. They're shaded a little different blue. There were independent kingdoms. This one, Aragon, and this one, Castile. Those kingdoms came together with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. They were the joint monarchs of Spain. And they completed the Reconquista in 1492 when their armies drove the Muslims from that last stronghold on the south here in Granada. So by 1492, Spain is now officially a Christian kingdom. They also established religious uniformity. Let me move me again because I'm going to be putting more pictures here. They made sure that there was only one religion in Spain, and that religion was Christianity. They ended religious tolerance that had existed under Muslim rule. Isabella especially launched a brutal campaign to convert all Jews and Muslims left in Spain. Any who did not convert were killed or forced to leave. And they were aided in this campaign by the Spanish Inquisition. This was a church court set up to put non-Christians on trial for heresy. And unless you could convince the court that you would honestly convert to Christianity, those put on trial were typically burned alive at the stake in front of large crowds, as you see here. Religious unity was achieved, but more than 150,000 people were killed or driven into exile from Spain. Okay, guys, so that wraps things up with this one talking about the Crusades and some religious conflict. And then in the next chapter, we're going to get into some cultural achievements of the Middle Ages.